What if the most important moment of your career was the one you regret the most? What if you were cast in a role that defined television history, only to realize, years later, that you made a choice on day one that you couldn't take back? This is the story of Jodie Whittaker, the 13th Doctor, the first woman to fly the TARDIS, the icon, the target, the one who shattered 60 years of tradition and was punished for it. She didn't fail. But the world acted like she did. And now, after nearly a decade of silence, she's revealing a single, haunting truth. I pitched the Doctor too quick, and I've regretted it ever since. This wasn't just an acting note. This wasn't about nerves. This was the root of everything that followed. Because when Jodie Whittaker became the Doctor, she wasn't stepping into a role. She was stepping into a war over tradition, a war over gender, a war over who is allowed to be the hero. And now, we know she felt it too. The pressure, the judgment, the whispers that turned into headlines, the fandom that split down the middle, some cheering, others sharpening their knives, and it all started with a single line delivery. A single decision. A voice pitched too fast, too light, too eager to be accepted. When your voice is the entire thing. She said, years later in an audio interview, I realized how many times I trip over sounds. What she's saying, without saying it outright, is chilling. She never felt safe to evolve. She was locked into a version of the Doctor she created under fire. And that version was designed for survival. Not truth, not growth. Survival. Because from the moment her casting was announced, the backlash began. Even though the Master had already been played by Michelle Gomez. Even though the lore already allowed it. Even though the show has always been about change. They called it political. They called it woke. They called it the downfall of the franchise. And in the middle of it all, stood one actress, holding the legacy of 13 men on her shoulders. If she succeeded, she would open the doors forever. If she failed, she'd be the excuse they used to close them again. So she made a choice. A choice to perform with speed, with brightness, with relentless energy. I basically pitched the Doctor too quick, in my very first episode, she said. And I've regretted it ever since. Because what started as enthusiasm became a trap. Every fast-paced scene locked in that tone. Every edit reinforced it. Every line reinforced the version of the Doctor that wasn't allowed to slow down. Because if she slowed down, people might notice. They might say she didn't belong. They might say she wasn't really the Doctor. But the truth is, she was. More than they knew. More than she was allowed to show. Because while the writing faltered, while the ratings slipped, while the pandemic shut down everything, Jodie Whittaker kept performing. Kept holding the line. Kept carrying the burden of the first. Until now. Now, with the cameras off and the scripts behind her, she finally gets to say what no one let her say then. She regrets how it started. Because the way it started dictated everything that came next. But her regret isn't weakness. It's honesty. It's the truth we rarely get from the people behind the TARDIS console. Because behind the smiles, the promotions, the BBC interviews, was a person who saw the entire fandom turn on her, and kept going anyway. And if you think this is just about Jodie Whittaker, you're wrong. Because this is about Doctor Who itself. Its past, its present, and its future. And the question no one at the BBC wants you to ask. What happens when the Doctor changes, and the fans don't? But before we reveal the next secret, the one the BBC tried to bury, subscribe to this channel right now. Because this is the only place uncovering the timelines they've tried to erase. The secrets buried under script drafts, and the truth about who really controls the TARDIS. Now let's talk about what came after the regret. Because Jodie Whittaker's performance wasn't the only thing under attack. Her very existence in the role became a lightning rod. And even now, years later, the backlash hasn't gone away. It's just shifted, turned quieter, more strategic, more institutional. And it starts with the BBC's decision during the 60th anniversary. The 60th anniversary of Doctor Who was meant to be a celebration, a tribute to the show's legacy, a multi-Doctor event full of surprises, nostalgia, and unity. But one name was missing: Jodie Whittaker. No cameo, no reference, no flashback, no scene. The first female Doctor, cut out of the party entirely. And that wasn't a scheduling issue. It wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. And the message was clear. Her era wasn't to be honored. It was to be skipped, as if she never existed. as if the timeline moved from Capaldi to Tennant without a middle, as if regret somehow justified erasure. But fans noticed. Wuvians asked the question, where was Jodie? Why didn't she appear in the 60th? Why wasn't she acknowledged? Why wasn't the doctor who changed the course of history even shown? Behind closed doors, insiders whispered. The BBC didn't want to risk polarizing the event, didn't want to stir the old debates, didn't want to remind the world of the moment that fandoms broke apart. So instead of facing the truth, they edited it out. But here's the irony. Jodie Whittaker is now more important than ever, because her era, despite the criticism, reveals the deepest truth about the franchise doctor, who doesn't struggle when it changes. It struggles when people refuse to accept that change. And that brings us to the real twist. Because Jodie's not alone. Another former Time Lord just broke his silence. Peter Davison, the fifth Doctor, offered a scathing critique of the modern era. Not just Jodie's. All of it. As the special effects got better, he said, there's a danger it becomes just about special effects. He called it trailer television. Style over substance. Noise over nuance. Huge gaps in the narrative. He added. Like you're watching a trailer for a Doctor Who show you'd like to watch later. And with that, Davison did something shocking. He agreed with the critics. Not the ones yelling about identity politics, but the ones who felt the soul of the show slipping. Not because of who the Doctor is, but because of how their stories are told. Fast. Flashy. Fractured. The exact thing Jodie Whittaker regrets about her own performance. I speak too quickly, she said. And I did it in my first episode, and I've regretted it ever since. She blames herself for a symptom, when the real problem is systemic. And that's the tragedy. She thinks it was her, when it was the pressure, the pacing, the scripts, the cuts, the fear that if she took even one breath too long, she'd lose them. But here's the twist, she didn't lose us. She made history. She created a Doctor that's inspired new fans, new writers, and future showrunners. And now, there are whispers inside the BBC that she may not be done, that the loop might not be closed, that a return is quietly being considered. But that, baby, is for the next chapter. There was a different ending planned, a version of the final episode that would have rewritten Doctor Who history. Not with a twist, not with a cliffhanger, but with a message. The original concept for Jodie Whittaker's regeneration was bold. Too bold, it turns out, because in early script discussions, now whispered about in interviews and fan forums, Chris Chibnall proposed something radical, a looped regeneration, where Jodie's Doctor wouldn't regenerate into someone else, but back into herself. It wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a joke. It was a statement. That Time Lords don't need to change to be valid. That you can be the Doctor again, and again, and again. Because you are enough. But the BBC said no. The idea was too confusing, too symbolic, and worst of all, too risky. Because the show was already under pressure. Ratings had slipped. Online outrage was loud. The pandemic had crushed momentum. The executives were looking for safety, not statements. And so the script was changed. The loop was erased. And the regeneration was reduced to a peaceful fade, out on a cliff, with a flash of golden energy and a hard cut to black. No self-regeneration. No symbol. No message. Just the end. And in its place, a familiar face, David Tennant, the most beloved Doctor of the modern era, brought back not to continue Jodie's legacy, but to replace it. To fix the show. To hit the nostalgia button and calm the backlash. But behind the scenes, some were horrified, because this wasn't a reboot. It was a retreat. A retreat from risk. A retreat from progress. A retreat from the woman who changed the show forever. And Jodie knew it. Because that looped regeneration idea, that wasn't just sci-fi. It was personal. It was her way of saying, I'm still here. I still matter. I still belong in this role. But she didn't get that moment. And the fans who grew up watching her, they didn't get closure. They got erasure. And that's why the 60th anniversary cut so deep. Because it wasn't just about a party. It was about canon, legacy, continuity, and the message that not every Doctor gets remembered. Some get deleted. But why? Why would the BBC erase the first female Doctor from a historic celebration? Because they thought it would be easier, cleaner, less polarizing. But the opposite happened. The silence spoke louder than any cameo. It said, this chapter didn't work. Let's pretend it never happened. Let's hit reset. But you can't erase time. and you definitely can't erase a Time Lord. Because Jodie Whittaker's Doctor is still alive in the timeline, still in canon, still inside fans' hearts. And now, with the conversation shifting, thanks to Big Finish, thanks to Gatwa's success, thanks to the voices of fans who grew up on her era, there's a growing demand for something impossible. Her return. Because her legacy didn't end at the cliff. It was cut short, and that's not just a theory. There are whispers from production insiders that the BBC is considering a legacy redemption episode, a one-off, a short story, a final regeneration that wasn't allowed to happen before. And you know what? They might need it. Because the cracks are starting to show again. Peter Davison's critique of the modern era wasn't just about Jodie. It was about now. He called it trailer television. Scenes stitched together. Moments over meaning. Flashes instead of arcs. And Jodie's regret. I basically pitched the Doctor too quick, and I've regretted it ever since. She wasn't just talking about speed. She was talking about the pace of the entire show. The desperation to hold attention. The fear that silence equals failure. The belief that every moment must sparkle or be cut. And that's the real danger. Because when a show like Doctor Who is afraid to breathe, it forgets how to live. It forgets how to be emotional, mysterious, weird, slow, dark, human. It becomes content, not story. It becomes a highlight reel, not an epic. And that's what Jodie Whittaker's regret really points to. Not a flaw in her, but a flaw in the system. She was racing to keep up with a machine that forgot how to pause. She performed for a show that demanded urgency, at the cost of truth. But here's the twist, she still delivered. She still made children believe. She still opened doors for queer, black, non-male, and non-binary fans. She still helped build the foundation for Ncuti Gatwa to rise. Because even if the BBC couldn't give her the looped regeneration, she gave it to someone else. She became the loop. And now, in whispers and rumors, there's talk of giving her one more story. A moment to reclaim the ending she was denied. And if it happens, if that scene gets shot, if we hear her voice echo through the vortex one more time, it won't just be redemption, it'll be justice. Because her biggest regret was never really hers to carry. It belonged to all of us. To the ones who rushed her, judged her, forgot her. And now, it's time